esteem. Let's start with something that many people struggle to even name. When you grow up with a narcissistic parent, criticism doesn't feel like guidance. It doesn't feel like teaching. Esteem. It doesn't feel like protection. It feels sharp. It feels destabilizing. And yet, you're told it's love. Healthy correction is specific, proportionate, and aimed at growth. Esteem. If a child forgets homework, a healthy parent might say, "Let's figure out a system so this doesn't happen again." There's a problem-solving tone. The message is, you made a mistake. Esteem. But you are not the mistake. But with a narcissistic parent, criticism operates very differently. It isn't about the homework. It's about power. It's about hierarchy, esteem. It's about ensuring that no matter what you do, they remain above you. You might hear things like, "How could you be so careless?" Or, "What's wrong with you?" Notice the shift, esteem. The issue isn't the behavior. The issue becomes your character, your intelligence, your worth. And when that pattern repeats over years, the child doesn't just learn to fix mistakes, esteem. The child learns to question their own existence. Criticism in this dynamic becomes a control strategy. Control doesn't always look loud. It doesn't always look like rage, esteem. Sometimes it looks like constant commentary, a running narrative about your body, your friends, your choices, your tone of voice, esteem. Why would you wear that? That's not how you speak to people. You'll never succeed if you keep doing that. There's an endless stream of evaluation. You are under surveillance, esteem. And here's what makes it so confusing. It's often disguised as concern. "I'm just trying to help you. No one else will tell you the truth. I say this because I love you." Esteem. If you push back, you're ungrateful. If you defend yourself, you're disrespectful. If you feel hurt, you're too sensitive. So you start absorbing it, esteem. You start believing that maybe this is what love sounds like. Maybe love is supposed to sting. But let's slow that down. Genuine love supports growth without eroding dignity, esteem. It corrects without humiliating, it guides without shaming. When criticism is constant, unpredictable, and personal, it's not correction, it's conditioning, esteem. The narcissistic parent needs the upper hand. They need to feel superior, knowledgeable, indispensable, esteem. And one of the fastest ways to maintain that position is to keep you slightly off balance. If you are confident, if you trust your own judgment, if you feel secure in your abilities, esteem, you don't need them in the same way. That autonomy can feel threatening to someone who relies on control to regulate their own fragile self-esteem. So the criticism continues, esteem. You bring home an award. "Well, let's see if you can do it again." You share good news. Don't get ahead of yourself. You express excitement. Life isn't that easy. It's subtle, esteem. It's strategic. And over time, it creates dependence. Because now you're not just living your life, you're scanning it through their lens. You're asking, will this be good enough, esteem? Will this disappoint them? How will this be judged? You become hypervigilant. Children are wired to seek parental approval. That's not weakness, that's biology. Esteem. We are attachment-driven beings. So when approval is scarce and criticism is abundant, the child doesn't conclude, "My parent has an issue." The child concludes, "I need to try harder," esteem. And that's where the trap locks in. You start performing instead of developing. You start curating instead of exploring. You don't ask, "What do I enjoy?" You ask, esteem. What will earn praise? Your choices become strategies for avoiding shame. This is not growth. This is survival. In healthy families, mistakes are framed as part of learning, esteem. In narcissistic systems, mistakes are ammunition. They're brought up years later. They're used in arguments. They're woven into narratives about your incompetence, esteem. You've always been irresponsible. Remember when you messed that up. There's no expiration date on your flaws. And when flaws are never allowed to fade, esteem, you never get to feel fully redeemed. You remain the child who needs correcting. That's control. Control also shows up in comparison, esteem. Why can't you be more like your sister? Look at the neighbor's son. Comparison keeps you striving, but never arriving. It shifts the focus outward, esteem. You are not allowed to define success for yourself. Success is externally assigned. Now imagine living in that psychological climate for 18, 20, 30 years. Imagine hearing daily, esteem, weekly, monthly messages that imply you are almost good but not quite, almost smart but not quite, almost attractive but not quite. What happens is something profound and painful, esteem. You internalize the critic. Long after you leave home, the voice remains. You get a job offer, and instead of celebrating, your mind says, "Don't mess this up." You start a relationship, esteem, and you think, "They'll see who I really am." You look in the mirror and automatically scan for defects. The parent doesn't have to be in the room anymore. The control has been installed, esteem. And here's the heartbreaking part. Many adult children defend this dynamic. They'll say, esteem, they were just strict. They wanted the best for me. That's how they were raised. And while context matters, impact matters more. Chronic criticism shapes nervous systems, esteem. It wires you for anxiety. It primes you for people-pleasing. It can even make you gravitate toward partners who replicate the same pattern because it feels familiar. Esteem. Familiar does not mean healthy. Let's be very clear about something. Discipline is not abuse. Accountability is not narcissism. But when criticism is relentless, disproportionate, esteem, and tied to identity rather than behavior, we are no longer talking about healthy parenting. We are talking about psychological dominance, esteem. The narcissistic parent often experiences your independence as rejection. So when you assert yourself, the criticism intensifies. You choose a career they don't approve of, esteem. That's unrealistic. You set a boundary. You've changed. You disagree. You think you know everything. It becomes risky to individuate. And individuation, becoming your own person, esteem, is supposed to be the goal of parenting. Healthy parents work themselves out of a job. They prepare you to leave. They celebrate your autonomy. Narcissistic parents often fear it, esteem, so they chip away at your confidence, not always consciously, not always maliciously in the cinematic sense, but consistently enough that the effect is undeniable, esteem. Criticism keeps you tethered. If you doubt yourself, you may come back for reassurance. If you feel incapable, you may defer decisions. If you fear failure, esteem, you may avoid risks that would take you further from their influence. This is how control maintains itself quietly. And if you're listening to this and recognizing yourself, esteem, I want you to pause and consider something radical. What if the problem was never your inadequacy? What if the criticism served a function that had nothing to do with your growth, esteem? That realization can be destabilizing. It can also be liberating, because once you see criticism as control, you stop chasing it as instruction. You start evaluating it. You ask, esteem, is this feedback constructive or is it diminishing? You begin to separate useful information from psychological noise. That separation is the beginning of reclaiming your power, esteem. But it doesn't happen overnight. The body remembers. The nervous system still flinches. A simple comment from your parent can still reduce you to 12 years old in seconds, esteem. That regression is not weakness, it's conditioning. The work is learning to tolerate that discomfort without surrendering your autonomy, esteem. It's recognizing that love does not require humiliation, that growth does not require shame, that guidance does not require control. And as we move forward in this conversation, esteem, we're going to talk about how this constant criticism creates moving goalposts, how it erodes identity, how it confuses you in public and wounds you in private, and most importantly, esteem, how you break free. But before we get there, I want to leave you with this foundational truth. When criticism is used to keep you small, it was never about making you better, esteem. It was about making you controllable. And the moment you see that clearly, the control begins to crack, esteem. Once you begin to understand that the criticism was never really about correction but about control, the next piece of this pattern starts to make painful sense, esteem. Because if criticism is the tool, then moving goalposts are the mechanism that keeps you running. In a healthy family, effort leads to acknowledgement. Achievement leads to celebration, esteem. There is a sense of completion. You study hard, you pass the exam, and someone says, "I'm proud of you." That pride isn't inflated or performative. It's steady, esteem. It allows the child to feel something essential. I did something well, and it was enough. But in a narcissistic system, enough is a moving target. You get an A, and the response is esteem. Why wasn't it X? You get into a good college, and it's not the top school. You land a job and you hear, "Let's see how long you last." There's always a next bar, esteem, a higher bar, a shifting bar. The moment you reach one milestone, the focus jumps to the next deficiency. It's subtle but relentless. You're never allowed to rest in accomplishment, esteem. You're never allowed to internalize competence, because the second you feel secure, you become less controllable. And here's the psychological twist. This creates a performance-based identity, esteem. You begin to believe that love is conditional. Approval is conditional. Safety is conditional. You are valued for what you do, not for who you are. So you run. You run toward grades, esteem, toward promotions, toward applause, toward perfection, not because those things are inherently wrong, but because they become survival strategies, esteem. Each success feels like it might finally unlock the approval you've been chasing since childhood, but it never does. The goalposts shift again. And over time, esteem. This shifting creates something very dangerous: chronic inadequacy. No matter how objectively successful you become, internally you feel behind. You feel like a fraud, esteem. You feel like someone is about to discover that you're not actually good enough. This is how imposter syndrome often takes root in children of narcissistic parents, esteem. It doesn't come from incompetence. It comes from never being allowed to metabolize success. You were trained to scan for what's missing instead of what's working, esteem. And here's where it gets even more complex. Sometimes the narcissistic parent will briefly praise you, but the praise feels unstable. It's exaggerated one moment and withdrawn the next, esteem. It might even be followed by a subtle jab. You did well for once, or see what happens when you actually try. So even positive feedback feels loaded. You can't relax into it, esteem. You're waiting for the critique that's coming right behind it. This creates hyperachievement in some people. They become relentless high performers. Straight A students, workaholics, esteem. Overfunctioners in relationships, they become the responsible one, the reliable one, the fixer. On the outside, they look successful. On the inside, they're exhausted, esteem. Because when goalposts move, there is no finish line. There is no arrival. There is only the next test. And some children respond differently. Some eventually stop running. They think, esteem, why bother? If nothing is ever enough, if the standard keeps shifting, then motivation collapses. You might see procrastination, avoidance. Self-sabotage, it's not laziness, esteem, it's learned futility. If the reward is always withheld, the nervous system eventually says, this game is rigged. But whether you overachieve or disengage, the root is the same, esteem. You were raised in an environment where stability was replaced by evaluation. Let's talk about what that does to your internal compass. When goalposts move constantly, esteem, you stop developing intrinsic motivation. Instead of asking, what do I want? You ask, what will satisfy them? You become externally oriented. Your sense of worth is outsourced, esteem. And that doesn't just affect your childhood, it follows you into adulthood, into your career, into your friendships, into your romantic relationships, esteem. You may find yourself drawn to bosses who are hard to please, partners who are emotionally withholding, friends who subtly compete with you. Not because you consciously want that dynamic, esteem, but because your nervous system recognizes it. It feels familiar. You know how to operate in that environment. You know how to strive. But striving is not the same as thriving, esteem. Another critical piece here is comparison. In narcissistic households, comparison is often weaponized, esteem. Your brother did it faster? Your cousin earns more. Other kids don't struggle like this. Comparison ensures that the goalpost never stays still because there is always someone ahead of you in some domain, esteem. Comparison also fractures sibling relationships. Instead of solidarity, there's rivalry. Instead of support, there's competition. The parent remains the evaluator at the center, esteem. Distributing approval like a scarce resource. Scarcity creates desperation, and desperation keeps you compliant. If approval feels rare, you work harder for it. If love feels conditional, esteem, you contort yourself to earn it. You may even suppress parts of your identity, your interests, your opinions, your personality traits. If they don't align with the parent's ideal, esteem, you become who you think you need to be. Now imagine living decades in that pattern. Imagine building an entire adult identity around chasing moving goalposts. You may accumulate degrees, esteem, titles, achievements, accolades, and yet inside there's a quiet emptiness, a sense that you've been running on a treadmill, because the original race was never yours, esteem. This is where many adult children hit a wall. They reach a milestone, maybe it's financial stability, maybe it's marriage, maybe it's parenthood, and instead of feeling fulfilled, esteem, they feel confused. Why am I not happier? The answer often lies in this early conditioning. When you are trained to chase shifting standards, you lose connection with internal satisfaction, esteem. Joy feels foreign. Rest feels undeserved. Even celebration can trigger anxiety because you're waiting for the next demand. Let's also acknowledge the shame component. When the goalposts move, esteem, and you inevitably can't meet the new standard, immediately shame rushes in. Now I should be better. I should be further. What's wrong with me? That shame becomes self-policing, esteem. The parent doesn't even have to criticize anymore. You do it for them. And here's the tragedy: many of these parents genuinely believe they are motivating their child, esteem. They may even point to your achievements as evidence that their method worked. Look at how successful you are. But success built on chronic anxiety is not the same as healthy development, esteem. The cost matters. If your success comes with insomnia, panic attacks, inability to relax, fear of failure, and a constant inner critic, that's not resilience. That's adaptation to instability, esteem. So what does it look like to step off the moving treadmill? It begins with awareness, recognizing that the goalposts were never meant to stay still, esteem, that the game was structured to keep you striving, and that striving kept you seeking validation from the very source that withheld it. It also involves grieving, esteem, grieving the fact that you may never get the stable, unconditional pride you deserved, grieving the childhood where achievement could have simply been celebrated without caveats, esteem. That grief can feel heavy, but it's also clarifying. Because once you accept that the goalposts will always move in that relationship, you stop organizing your life around reaching them, esteem. You start asking different questions. What feels meaningful to me? What is enough for me? What pace feels sustainable? You begin redefining success internally rather than relationally. Esteem. This is not easy. Your nervous system will resist. It will whisper, do more, be better, don't slow down. But that voice is an echo of a system designed to keep you running. Esteem. The real work is building tolerance for enough, allowing yourself to finish a project and not immediately move to the next, letting yourself enjoy an accomplishment without diminishing it. Esteem. Speaking to yourself in ways that are firm but not cruel. And when the old comments come, that's all, you could have done more, you start to see them for what they are. Esteem. Predictable shifts in a game you are no longer obligated to play. As we continue this journey, we'll explore how this constant striving erodes identity and creates deep self-doubt. Esteem. We'll talk about the public-private split that adds another layer of confusion. And eventually we'll talk about reclaiming your own voice. But for now, hold on to this. Esteem. If the goalposts always moved, it was never because you were falling short. It was because the finish line was never meant for you to reach. And you don't have to keep running. Esteem. When you grow up in an environment where criticism is constant and the goalposts never stay still, something deeper begins to happen beneath the surface. It's not just that you feel pressured. Esteem. It's not just that you feel anxious. Over time, your very sense of self starts to erode, and this is where the impact becomes profound. Esteem. Children don't come into the world questioning their worth. They learn it relationally. They learn who they are by watching how caregivers respond to them. When a child is met with warmth, esteem, attunement, and consistency, they internalize a quiet but powerful belief: I am okay, I matter, my feelings make sense. But when a child is repeatedly met with criticism, dismissal, esteem, and invalidation, a very different belief begins to take root. It's subtle at first. It might sound like, I messed up, that's normal. But in a narcissistic system, esteem, that quickly shifts into something more global. I am a mess up. Do you hear the difference? One is about behavior. The other is about identity. Identity erosion doesn't happen overnight. Esteem. It happens in moments. It happens when a child expresses excitement about something and is told it's silly. When they cry and are told they're dramatic. Esteem. When they voice an opinion and are told they don't know what they're talking about. When their feelings are minimized with, you're overreacting, or that didn't happen. Esteem. If your emotional reality is repeatedly questioned, you begin to doubt your own internal experience. And when you can't trust your own feelings, esteem, you lose one of the most fundamental anchors of identity. You start scanning outward instead of inward. What do they think? Is this the right reaction? Am I allowed to feel this way? Esteem. Over time, the child learns that their authentic self is not safe. So they adapt. They become more agreeable, more compliant, or sometimes more invisible. Esteem. They shift depending on what the environment demands. And that shape-shifting becomes exhausting. One of the most common things adult children of narcissistic parents say is, esteem. I don't know who I am. They may be high-functioning, they may be accomplished. But when you ask them what they genuinely like, what they deeply value, what feels true to them, esteem, there's often a pause. Because so much of their development was organized around avoiding criticism and chasing moving goalposts that there wasn't space to explore identity safely. Esteem. When your preferences are mocked, you stop expressing them. When your ideas are dismissed, you stop offering them. When your emotions are invalidated, you stop trusting them. Esteem. This is identity erosion, and it creates fertile ground for anxiety and perfectionism. Let's talk about perfectionism for a moment. In this context, perfectionism isn't about high standards, esteem. It's about protection. If you can just get everything right, maybe you won't be criticized. If you can anticipate every flaw, maybe you can prevent the next attack. Esteem. Perfectionism becomes armor. But armor is heavy, and it isolates you. Because when you're constantly trying to appear flawless, you don't let people see your vulnerability. Esteem. You don't let yourself experiment. You don't let yourself fail publicly. And failure in a narcissistic family system was often catastrophic. It wasn't treated as part of growth. Esteem. It was treated as evidence of deficiency. So you learn that mistakes equal shame. That shame doesn't just disappear when you become an adult. It follows you into job interviews, esteem, relationships, parenting, creative pursuits. It whispers, don't mess this up. And if something does go wrong, the internal critic explodes. Now here's the part that's particularly painful, esteem. Many people internalize the narcissistic parent's voice so deeply that it becomes indistinguishable from their own thoughts. You may think you're just being self-aware, but the tone is harsh, esteem. It's absolute. It uses words like always and never. I always ruin things. I'll never get this right. That's not balanced self-reflection. That's internalized invalidation, esteem. And because that voice feels familiar, it feels true. Identity erosion also shows up in relationships. If you don't trust your perceptions, you're more vulnerable to manipulation, esteem. If someone gaslights you, you might think, maybe they're right. Maybe I'm remembering it wrong. If someone crosses a boundary, esteem, you might hesitate to speak up because you're unsure whether your discomfort is legitimate. When your reality was repeatedly questioned in childhood, you learn to question it yourself, esteem. Another layer of identity erosion involves emotional suppression. If expressing anger led to punishment, you may disconnect from anger altogether. If sadness was mocked, you may shut it down, esteem. If joy was minimized, you may temper it. Over time, your emotional range narrows. You operate within what feels safe, and safe often means muted. But emotions are data, esteem. They inform you about your needs, your boundaries, your desires. When they're suppressed, you lose valuable information about yourself, esteem. So the adult child might look composed on the outside, but feel disconnected on the inside. They might say, esteem, I don't know what I feel, or I feel numb. That numbness is not a personality flaw, it's an adaptation. And here's something else that happens, esteem. Identity becomes contingent on external roles. You might define yourself entirely by your job title, your achievements, your relationship status, or your ability to take care of others, esteem, because those roles provided structure in a childhood where your internal world wasn't validated. But when a role shifts, a job loss, a breakup, children growing up, esteem, there can be a profound identity crisis. If I'm not this, then who am I? That question can feel terrifying if you were never given the space to develop a stable internal sense of self-esteem. This erosion also feeds chronic self-doubt. Even when you make decisions independently, you second-guess them. You might ask multiple people for reassurance, esteem. You might replay conversations in your head, analyzing whether you said the wrong thing. Because deep down, there's a core belief, I can't fully trust myself, esteem. That belief didn't appear out of nowhere. It was cultivated in an environment where your perceptions were minimized, your achievements were never quite enough, esteem, and your identity was constantly under evaluation. And yet, here's what's important, the authentic self doesn't disappear, it gets buried, it gets quiet, but it remains, esteem. You can often see glimpses of it in moments when someone feels safe. In creativity, in humor, in passion, in the way someone lights up when they talk about something they love, esteem. That's the self that was overshadowed, not destroyed. Reclaiming that self requires something radical, learning to validate your own experience. It starts small, esteem. I felt hurt when that happened. Not, maybe I'm overreacting. Just stating it, it involves experimenting with preferences, trying things because you're curious, esteem, not because they're impressive. It involves allowing yourself to make decisions without pulling the room. And yes, it will feel uncomfortable, esteem, because when you've been conditioned to distrust yourself, self-trust feels risky. But every time you honor your own perception, you strengthen that internal anchor, esteem. Every time you respond to yourself with compassion instead of criticism, you weaken the internalized voice of invalidation, esteem. We're going to talk more about how public praise and private devaluation add another layer of confusion. And we'll talk about the emotional traps that keep you questioning your sensitivity, esteem. But this piece, this erosion of identity, is central because when someone's sense of self has been systematically undermined, healing isn't just about setting boundaries with the parent, esteem. It's about rebuilding an internal foundation. It's about learning that your feelings are real, your perceptions are valid, your preferences matter. Your worth is not conditional, esteem. And that rebuilding takes time. It takes repetition. It takes surrounding yourself with people who reflect you accurately instead of distorting you. But I want you to hear this clearly, esteem. If you struggle with self-doubt, if you battle perfectionism, if you feel like you don't quite know who you are, that does not mean you are broken, esteem. It means you adapted to an environment that required you to shrink. And the work now is expansion, because the most powerful act of resistance in a system that eroded your identity is this, esteem. To know yourself, to trust yourself, and to live from that place unapologetically. And that is how you begin to come back home to yourself, esteem. There's another layer to this dynamic that makes it even more disorienting. Up until now, we've talked about criticism, moving goalposts, and the erosion of identity, esteem. But what truly destabilizes many children of narcissistic parents is the split, the public praise and the private devaluation. On the outside, the parent can look generous, involved, esteem, even proud. They might brag about your accomplishments to friends. They might post glowing messages about you. They might introduce you as my brilliant child at gatherings. To the world, esteem, they appear supportive. And then you get in the car to go home. Suddenly the tone shifts. Don't let that go to your head. You embarrassed me when you said that. Next time, esteem, try not to look so awkward. The warmth evaporates. What was praised 5 minutes ago becomes critique. That split is not just confusing, it's psychologically destabilizing, esteem. Because now you're holding two opposing realities at the same time. The world sees a loving parent, You experience something very different behind closed doors, esteem. And when those two realities don't match, you start questioning your own perception. You think, maybe I'm exaggerating. They were nice tonight. Other people think they're amazing, esteem. Maybe I'm the problem. This is how isolation begins. In healthy families, there is consistency. The way a parent speaks to you privately and publicly may differ in tone, but not in essence. Esteem. Respect remains. Encourageability remains. There isn't a dramatic flip in character. But in narcissistic dynamics, image management is critical. Reputation matters. Esteem, appearances matter. The parent may be deeply invested as devoted, self-sacrificing, exceptional. Your achievements become part of that image. You are not just their child, esteem, you are an extension of their brand. So in public, your success reflects well on them. It's celebrated loudly. In private, however, the dynamic of control resumes, esteem. The praise was never about nurturing you. It was about reinforcing their image. And if you falter publicly, if you say something they don't like, esteem, dress in a way that doesn't fit their narrative, express an independent thought. The correction afterward can be sharp and disproportionate. You might hear, esteem. Do you know how that made me look? Notice the focus. Not how you felt, not what you intended, but how they appeared. This is where children learn to become hyper-aware of optics, esteem. You start monitoring yourself not only for mistakes, but for how your behavior might impact the parent's image. You become a representative instead of a person. That role is heavy, esteem. And because outsiders often only see the polished version, you may feel alone in your experience. If you try to confide in someone, they might respond with disbelief, esteem. Your parent is so nice. They're so proud of you. You're lucky. That invalidation compounds the confusion. Now you're not only doubting your parent, esteem, you're doubting yourself in the face of social reinforcement. It becomes easier to minimize your own pain than to challenge the widely accepted narrative, esteem. This public-private split also creates a particular kind of anxiety. You never quite know which version of the parent you're going to get. The supportive one in front of others, esteem, or the critical one afterward. That unpredictability keeps your nervous system on alert. You may find yourself scanning their facial expressions at events, watching for subtle shifts, esteem, preparing for the post-event debrief in your head before it even happens. That's not normal relaxation. That's vigilance. Over time, this dynamic can fracture trust in a profound way. Esteem, because praise no longer feels safe. Compliments feel conditional. Even kindness can feel strategic. Esteem. You might struggle to accept positive feedback from others later in life, because you learn that praise can flip into criticism without warning. You brace yourself. You wait for the esteem. This split also impacts sibling relationships. Sometimes one child is idealized publicly while another is subtly undermined, esteem, or the roles rotate depending on what best serves the parent's image. The golden child one day may be criticized the next. The shifting keeps everyone off balance, esteem. And when there's no stable narrative about who you are in the family, identity confusion deepens. Another painful aspect of public praise and private devaluation is the shame it generates, esteem. When criticism happens privately, it often comes with intensity that no one else witnesses. You may be told you're selfish, ungrateful, dramatic, esteem. You may be reminded of past mistakes in detail. And because it happens behind closed doors, there are no witnesses to validate your experience. Shame thrives in secrecy, esteem. You might walk into a room smiling, while inside you're replaying harsh words spoken moments before. That emotional whiplash is exhausting. It teaches you to compartmentalize, esteem, to split yourself, and splitting yourself becomes a survival strategy. There's the public you, composed, high-functioning, agreeable. And then there's the private you, anxious, self-doubting, esteem, bracing for impact. Integration becomes difficult because you were trained to perform stability rather than experience it. Let's also talk about gaslighting within this split, esteem. If you ever confront the parent about the criticism, you might hear, "I was just joking. You're too sensitive. I was praising you all night," esteem. Why are you focusing on one little comment? The public praise is used as evidence that the private devaluation didn't really happen or didn't matter. That's profoundly invalidating, esteem, because it erases the emotional reality of what occurred when the audience disappeared. This dynamic often extends into adulthood, esteem. The parent may continue presenting a glowing narrative about you to others while privately undermining your decisions, your partner, your career choices, esteem. You may feel pressure to maintain the illusion for the sake of family harmony. Breaking that illusion can feel terrifying. It might mean disappointing extended family, esteem. It might mean confronting long-standing myths. It might mean stepping out of a carefully curated story. But here's the truth, esteem. Maintaining an image that contradicts your lived experience costs you your authenticity, and authenticity is essential for healing. when we talk about recovery from narcissistic parenting, esteem. We're not just talking about setting boundaries. We're talking about reconciling these split realities. We're talking about allowing yourself to acknowledge that both things can be true, esteem. Your parent may have appeared generous publicly, and they may have been deeply invalidating privately. Holding that complexity is mature. It's nuanced. It doesn't require demonizing esteem, but it does require honesty. Because until you name the split, you remain caught in it, esteem. One of the most liberating steps adult children take is finding safe spaces where they can speak their experience without being contradicted. Therapy, support groups, trusted friends, esteem, places where the private reality is witnessed and validated. When someone says, "That makes sense, I can see how that would hurt," something shifts. The isolation softens, esteem. The internal narrative begins to reorganize. You start trusting your perception again, and as that trust grows, the public image loses its grip. You no longer feel compelled to defend it, esteem. You can let others have their version of the story without sacrificing your own truth. That doesn't mean it's easy. There may still be grief. There may still be anger, esteem. There may still be moments where you wish the public praise had matched private support, but clarity replaces confusion. As we continue, we'll talk about the emotional booby traps, esteem, the ways your feelings were dismissed as oversensitivity, and we'll move toward how you reclaim your inner voice after years of distortion. But I want to leave you with this understanding, esteem. When someone praises you in public and diminishes you in private, the inconsistency is not a reflection of your worth. It is a reflection of their need for control and image, esteem. And once you see the split clearly, you no longer have to split yourself to survive it. Now we come to one of the most insidious parts of this entire dynamic, esteem. We've talked about criticism as control. We've talked about moving goalposts. We've talked about identity erosion and the public-private split, esteem. But none of those patterns sustain themselves without one powerful reinforcement mechanism, the emotional booby trap. And that trap sounds like this. You're too sensitive. Esteem, it may also sound like you're overreacting. Why are you making such a big deal out of this? I was just joking. You can't take constructive criticism. On the surface, esteem, those phrases seem mild. They don't sound explosive. They don't sound overtly abusive. But over time, they reshape your relationship with your own emotions. Let's slow this down, esteem. When a child expresses hurt, a healthy parent might say, "I didn't realize that upset you. Let's talk about it." Even if the parent disagrees with the child's interpretation, esteem, there is room for the child's emotional experience. There is space for dialogue. But in a narcissistic dynamic, the child's hurt is often treated as the problem, esteem. The focus shifts from what was said or done to how the child reacted. The issue is no longer the criticism, the comparison, or the demeaning comment. The issue becomes your sensitivity, esteem, and that shift is profound. Because now, instead of examining behavior, you're examining yourself. Maybe I am too emotional. Maybe I shouldn't feel this way. Maybe I'm dramatic, esteem. That's how the trap works. It redirects attention away from the harmful action and places it squarely on your emotional response. Over time, you begin policing yourself, esteem. You hesitate before expressing discomfort. You minimize your own pain. You might even preface your feelings with disclaimers. This is probably stupid, esteem. Or, I know I'm being sensitive. You learned that your feelings are inconvenient. But here's what's important to understand: sensitivity is not weakness. Sensitivity is attunement. Esteem, it's awareness. It's the capacity to register nuance. In healthy environments, sensitivity is guided, not shamed. In narcissistic systems, however, esteem, emotions that threaten control are often invalidated. If your hurt challenges the parent's authority, your hurt will be dismissed. If your anger disrupts their image, esteem, your anger will be reframed as disrespect. So you start disconnecting from certain emotions altogether. Anger is often the first to go, because anger signals boundary violations, esteem. And in a system where boundaries are not respected, anger is dangerous, so you suppress it. You tell yourself you're fine, you rationalize, you intellectualize, esteem. But suppressed anger doesn't disappear. It turns inward, it becomes self-criticism, it becomes anxiety, it becomes depression, esteem. And then when the pressure builds and you finally do react strongly, that reaction is used as further evidence that you are, in fact, too sensitive. The original pattern is reinforced, esteem. It's a closed loop. This emotional booby trap also keeps you from developing confidence in your own perceptions. If every emotional response is questioned, esteem, you begin to question the validity of emotion itself. You may pride yourself on being logical, rational, detached. But often that detachment is protective, esteem. You learned that feeling deeply leads to punishment or ridicule. So you numbed. But here's the cost of that numbing: when you disconnect from painful emotions, you also dampen joy, excitement, esteem, and connection. Emotional suppression doesn't discriminate. Another layer to this trap is humor. Narcissistic parents often cloak cutting remarks in sarcasm. Esteem. Can't you take a joke? Becomes the shield. But humor that consistently targets your vulnerabilities is not playful. It's diminishing. And when you object, esteem, you're told you lack a sense of humor. Now your personality is under scrutiny. Notice how the focus keeps shifting back to you. The original comment is never examined, esteem. The impact is never addressed. Instead, your reaction becomes the spectacle. This dynamic can follow you into adulthood in subtle but powerful ways. In relationships, esteem, you may tolerate dismissiveness longer than others would. If a partner says something hurtful and then minimizes it, you might default to self-doubt rather than asserting your boundary, esteem. In the workplace, if a supervisor gives harsh feedback, you might internalize it without question, even if it's unfair, esteem. You may assume the problem is your resilience rather than their delivery, because you were trained to believe that emotional discomfort equals personal deficiency, esteem. Let's also talk about crying. Many adult children of narcissistic parents feel intense shame around tears. If crying was mocked or punished, it becomes something to hide, esteem. You might apologize for crying. You might leave the room. You might feel humiliated afterward. But tears are a physiological release. They're part of the body's regulatory system, esteem. When you were shamed for crying, you weren't just shamed for emotion, you were shamed for being human. And when humanity feels unsafe, authenticity shrinks, esteem. The emotional booby trap also creates a particular kind of confusion during conflict. You might enter disagreements already doubting yourself. You might over-explain, over-justify, esteem, over-apologize, because deep down you're bracing to be told that your feelings are excessive. And when someone finally validates you, when someone says, "That makes sense," esteem, it can feel almost shocking. You may not even know how to receive it. Here's something else that often happens. You may become the emotional caretaker. If your feelings were dismissed, esteem, you might become hyper-attuned to everyone else's. You make space for their emotions. You validate them. You soothe them. But you struggle to extend the same compassion inward, esteem. That imbalance is not accidental. It was shaped by a system where your emotional needs were secondary to maintaining control and image. Now, esteem, breaking free from this trap requires a shift that can feel radical. You must begin to treat your emotions as data, not defects. When you feel hurt, instead of asking, esteem, "What's wrong with me?" you ask, "What happened?" When you feel angry, instead of suppressing it, you ask, "What boundary might have been crossed?" When you feel anxious, esteem, you explore the context rather than assuming weakness. This is relearning emotional literacy. It also involves tolerating discomfort when others are unhappy with your feelings, esteem. That can be especially difficult if you were conditioned to keep the peace. But part of healing is accepting that your emotions may not always be convenient for others, esteem, and that doesn't make them illegitimate. You may still hear that old voice. Don't be dramatic. Calm down. You're making this bigger than it is. But now, esteem, instead of automatically obeying it, you can pause and examine it. Whose voice is that? Where did I learn that? Is it actually true? The more you practice this, esteem, the more you separate your authentic emotional experience from the internalized narrative of oversensitivity. And here's the deeper truth, esteem. What was labeled as too sensitive was often simply accurate perception. You noticed inconsistencies. You felt the sting of criticism. You registered unfairness, esteem. Sensitivity was your awareness trying to protect you. It was never the enemy. As we move toward the final piece of this conversation, reclaiming your inner voice, esteem, it's important to understand that you cannot rebuild identity without restoring trust in your emotions. They are the compass. If someone taught you to distrust your compass, esteem, of course you feel lost. But the compass was never broken, it was covered in doubt, and so the work now is gentle but firm. You begin listening inward again, esteem. You allow feelings to arise without immediate judgment. You validate yourself even if others don't. Because when you stop apologizing for your emotional reality, esteem, you dismantle one of the strongest pillars of the narcissistic control system. And here's the line I want you to carry with you: your emotions were never the problem. Esteem, the system that punished them, was. Esteem. So after all of this, the criticism disguised as correction, the moving goalposts that kept you running, the erosion of identity, the public-private split, the emotional booby traps, esteem, we come to the question that matters most. Now what? Because understanding the pattern is powerful. But understanding alone does not automatically free you. Insight opens the door, esteem. Action is what walks you through it. Breaking the trap begins with something both simple and incredibly difficult: recognizing that the voice in your head may not actually be yours, esteem. For many adult children of narcissistic parents, there is a relentless inner critic. It comments on your performance. It questions your choices. It anticipates failure. It scans for flaws, esteem. And because it has been there for so long, it feels like your own thinking. But when you slow it down, when you really listen to the tone, you may notice something familiar. The phrasing, esteem, the sharpness, the absolutism, the always and never, the impatience, the disappointment, that voice was installed. And here's the key shift: you can observe it without obeying it, esteem. That's the beginning of reclaiming your inner authority. At first, it might feel unnatural. You might catch yourself thinking, that presentation was terrible, esteem, I'm so incompetent. And instead of spiraling, you pause and ask, is that objectively true, or is that the old narrative? This is not about toxic positivity. It's not about pretending everything is perfect. It's about accuracy. It's about replacing inherited distortion with grounded evaluation. Reclaiming your voice also means redefining enough, esteem. Remember those moving goalposts. You have to decide where you want to place them and then allow them to stay still, esteem. That might mean finishing a project and consciously choosing not to immediately add another demand. It might mean acknowledging your effort, even if the outcome wasn't flawless, esteem. It means letting completion feel like completion, and that can be deeply uncomfortable, because when you've been trained to equate worth with constant striving, rest can feel dangerous, esteem. Satisfaction can feel like laziness, but sustainable growth requires rest. Identity requires space. Boundaries are another essential piece of breaking the trap. Now, let's be honest, esteem. Boundaries with narcissistic parents are rarely simple. They may be met with guilt, with accusations of selfishness or betrayal. You may hear, esteem, after everything I've done for you, or you've changed. Yes, you have changed. That's the point. A boundary is not an attack, it's a definition. It says, esteem. This is what I will and will not accept. It doesn't require the other person's agreement to be valid. But here's what makes boundaries so difficult for adult children in this dynamic, esteem. You were conditioned to prioritize the parent's emotional comfort over your own. So when you set a boundary, your nervous system may light up with anxiety, esteem. You may feel guilty even if the boundary is reasonable. That guilt is learned. It is not evidence that you're wrong, esteem. Breaking the trap means tolerating that guilt long enough to see that the world does not collapse when you assert yourself, esteem. It means understanding that someone else's disappointment is not proof of your cruelty. Another part of reclaiming your inner voice is grieving. And this is the part people often want to skip, esteem. There is grief in accepting that you may never receive the validation you deserved, esteem. There is grief in recognizing that some of the milestones you achieved were driven by survival rather than joy. There is grief in acknowledging the emotional safety you didn't have, esteem. Grief is not weakness, it is integration. When you allow yourself to mourn what was missing, you stop unconsciously chasing it. You stop trying to earn it retroactively, esteem. You begin building something new instead of attempting to fix something old. This rebuilding often involves reparenting yourself. That phrase can sound abstract, but it's very practical, esteem. It means speaking to yourself in ways you should have been spoken to. It means offering structure without shame. It means validating your feelings while still holding yourself accountable. Esteem. If you make a mistake, instead of, what's wrong with you? It becomes, that didn't go the way I hoped. What can I learn? That shift may sound small, esteem, but over time it rewires your internal environment. And then there's self-trust. For many adult children of narcissistic parents, decision-making feels paralyzing, esteem. You might crowdsource opinions. You might seek reassurance repeatedly, because deep down you were taught that your instincts were flawed. Rebuilding self-trust happens in increments, esteem. You make a small decision and live with it. You choose something based on your preference rather than anticipated approval, esteem. You let yourself experience the outcome without immediately self-criticizing. Each time you do that, you gather evidence I can navigate my own life, esteem. It's also important to examine the relationships you maintain in adulthood. Sometimes without realizing it, you replicate the dynamic. You may gravitate toward partners who are critical, esteem, emotionally unavailable or inconsistent, not because you want pain, but because your nervous system equates unpredictability with intimacy, esteem. Breaking the trap means recognizing when something feels familiar but unhealthy. It means choosing stability even if it feels unfamiliar at first. Healthy relationships may feel slower, esteem, less dramatic. That steadiness can initially feel boring to someone conditioned to emotional volatility, but over time it feels safe, and safety is transformative. Now, esteem. I want to acknowledge something important. Breaking this pattern does not require cutting off your parent in every case. For some people, limited contact with strong boundaries works. Esteem. For others, distance is necessary. There is no universal prescription. The question is not what looks right from the outside, esteem. The question is what allows you to maintain your psychological health. Freedom is not about punishing the parent. It's about releasing yourself. Esteem. There will still be moments when the old patterns try to reassert themselves. A comment may sting. A comparison may trigger you. An old wave of self-doubt may rise. Esteem. That doesn't mean you've failed. It means you're human. The difference now is awareness. Instead of collapsing into the narrative, you can step back. You can name it. Esteem. This is the criticism trap. This is the moving goalpost. This is the oversensitivity narrative. Naming interrupts the cycle. And over time, something remarkable happens. Esteem. The inner critic softens. The anxiety quiets. Decisions feel less catastrophic. Achievement feels less urgent. You begin to experience yourself not as a project to perfect esteem, but as a person to know. That is identity reclaimed. You stop performing worth and start inhabiting it. You stop asking, am I enough? And start asking, is this aligned with who I am? Esteem. And here's the most powerful shift of all. You realize that your value was never contingent on their approval. It never was. The criticism did not define you. Esteem. The shifting standards did not measure you. The invalidation did not erase you. The public image did not represent the whole story. You were adapting. You were surviving. Esteem. You were doing the best you could in a system that required you to shrink. Breaking free means allowing yourself to expand, and expansion can feel scary. It can feel exposed. Esteem. But it is also where authenticity lives. It is where peace lives. So if you take nothing else from this entire conversation, let it be this: you do not have to keep auditioning for love. Esteem. You do not have to keep proving your worth. You do not have to keep shrinking to maintain someone else's comfort. Esteem. The trap loses its power the moment you choose to trust your own voice over the one that tried to silence it. And that is where your freedom begins.